What would you do if your own mother pretended not to know you on Christmas Eve after you paid for the dinner she was serving to strangers? Madeline Whitmore spent years supporting her family from the shadows, sending money, showing up, sacrificing everything, only to be cast out like a stranger at her own doorstep. But this isn't a story about victimhood. It's about awakening, about what happens when a forgotten daughter returns, not to beg, but to rebuild. If you've ever been used, erased, or made to feel like love had a price, this story is for you. She gave them everything. Now she takes back her name. Snow flurried softly against the windshield as Madeline Whitmore tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the glow of her dashboard clock reading 5:46 p.m. She was less than 30 minutes from Lancaster now. The highway had narrowed into winding two-lane roads, flanked by leafless trees and frosted mailboxes. Familiar territory, yet unsettling in its sameness. Years had passed, but this place, this town, still clung to its image like an old portrait in a dusty frame. In the back seat, a homemade apple pie sat wrapped in foil, still warm from the oven, its scent mingling with the crisp smell of snow that snuck in every time she cracked the window. Next to it, a sleek silver tote bag brimming with carefully wrapped gifts, a cashmere sweater for her mother, spa vouchers for the new resort she'd once casually mentioned. For her brother Cameron, the limited edition gaming console he'd been hinting at for months, plus 2 concert tickets to his favorite band's reunion tour. Madeline had turned down a company-sponsored retreat to Montego Bay for this Christmas with family. She'd told her boss Lisa it was something she needed, not just wanted. What she hadn't told her was that this year more than any before, Madeline was desperate to feel something. Connection, gratitude, warmth. Anything. A memory surfaced uninvited. Madeline at 13, perched on a stool, hanging ornaments on a crooked tree with one hand, while steadying her baby brother with the other. Her mother, Eleanor, had called from the hospital. "Sorry, sweetheart, they're short-staffed again." That night, Madeline tucked Cameron in with a story, ate a microwaved dinner alone, and pretended she wasn't disappointed. That had been the rhythm for most of her childhood. Disappointment disguised as understanding. She shook the memory off as she turned onto Maple Avenue. Streetlights blinked on one by one, their amber hue casting long shadows across the snow-covered yards. Her mother's house appeared around the bend, larger than she remembered, dressed in elegant white lights that traced the roofline and spiraled around the porch columns. A red SUV, a luxury sedan, and her mother's blue Honda filled the driveway. Madeline parked along the curb, heart beginning to pound. Her reflection in the rear-view mirror looked older than she felt. Tired eyes, pale lips. She swiped on some lipstick, smoothed her dark coat, and reached for the tote bag and pie. As she walked up the path, Christmas music and the sound of laughter drifted from inside. The smell of roasted turkey hung in the air. Her pulse quickened, not with dread, but hope. Maybe things really had changed. Maybe finally she'd be welcomed not for what she gave, but for who she was. She rang the bell and waited. Inside, the music lowered slightly. Footsteps. The door swung open and there she was, Eleanor Whitmore. Hair recently dyed, curled into soft waves. A black dress clung to her slender frame, a wine glass in hand. Her lips parted in surprise, then quickly tightened into a practiced smile. "Sorry," Eleanor said, voice smooth and polished. "I think you have the wrong house." Madeline blinked, stunned. The pie tilted slightly in her hands. "It's me," she said, managing a breath. "It's Madeline." A shadow passed behind her mother. Crystal glasses clinked. A man's voice called out from the dining room. "Eleanor, who's at the door?" Her mother hesitated, then leaned forward. "You should have called first," she said softly. "This really isn't a good time." And before Madeline could form a response, the door began to close. Madeline reacted instinctively, wedging her boot in the narrowing space between the door and the frame. "Wait," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "At least take the gifts. I drove 12 hours for this." For a moment, Eleanor's eyes flickered, not with warmth, not even guilt, but calculation. Behind her, voices rose in laughter, the kind of laughter that echoed with clinking glassware and inside jokes. Laughter Madeline had once known, had once helped create. A new voice chimed in from within the house. Male, cheerful, relaxed. Cam, her girlfriend's telling that story about Aspen again. "Hurry up." Madeline froze. Aspen? Cameron had told her he was between jobs, that he was saving every cent. She had wired him $1,200, 0 cents just last month to get him through. The familiar stitch of betrayal tightened in her stomach. Eleanor glanced back over her shoulder, then looked at her daughter as if facing a stranger who'd arrived uninvited to the wrong address on the wrong night. "I told you," she said, her voice firm now. "This isn't a good time." The door began to move again, but not before another figure appeared in the background. Cameron. Dressed in a tailored button-down and charcoal gray slacks, he looked far more put together than the struggling little brother Madeline had sent grocery money to. His expression shifted when he saw her. Shock, hesitation, and then something harder to name. Not shame, not guilt. Panic. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, not addressing her by name, not calling her Maddie like he used to. Just a neutral, useless question that widened the distance between them. "She got the wrong address?" Eleanor replied quickly. Madeline's throat tightened. "Cameron," she said, pleading. "It's me." He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. Then placed a hand on their mother's shoulder. "We should get back," he said gently. Eleanor nodded. Her gaze settled on Madeline one final time, and her voice dropped to a low whisper. "You need to leave. You're making this awkward for everyone." Madeline's chest hollowed. "I'm your daughter," she said, a tremor running through her. "How is that awkward?" Eleanor's smile was brittle. "There are important people here tonight, people from the country club, from Richard's investment firm. We can talk tomorrow." The irony cut deep. Madeline had sent the money for tonight's dinner. The very turkey, the wine, the crystal on the table, purchased with her generosity. And now she was the shameful secret. "Just go, Madeline, please," Eleanor repeated. Inside, a countdown had begun, guests chanting in unison. 10, 9, 8. Madeline took a step back. The porch light above her cast a cold glare on the silver wrapping of the gift bag. She looked down at the pie she had cradled since Chicago. 7, 6, 5. Cameron turned without another word. Eleanor hesitated just long enough to whisper, "Merry Christmas." 4, 3, 2. The door closed, the latch clicked, and just like that, the illusion was shattered. Cheers erupted from inside as Madeline stood motionless in the snow. Her hands trembled. The pie slipped from her grasp and landed with a muted thud. The bag of gifts followed, falling beside it like discarded evidence of a foolish dream. Behind the frosted glass, silhouettes danced beneath chandeliers she had never seen. Music swelled. The warmth of the house remained sealed behind walls that no longer remembered her. Madeline turned toward the street, the wind biting at her cheeks, her breath rising in shallow bursts. The door hadn't just closed. It had disappeared. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Madeline sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, fingers frozen around her phone. Outside, the neon vacancy sign flickered against the falling snow, casting sickly red flashes across the window. Inside, everything felt still, except her chest, where breath and pain collided like waves against a cliff. She hadn't cried in the car. Not when she backed away from the curb. Not when she passed the quiet park where she once taught Cameron to ride a bike. Not even when she checked in with a cracked voice and a fake smile, saying she was just passing through. But now, in this motel room with plastic blinds and a television bolted to the wall, the silence gave way to the collapse. The sobs didn't come gently. They tore from her like something being ripped out, raw and sudden. Her shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to protect something inside her from breaking, but there was nothing left to guard. When her breathing finally slowed, Madeline lay back and stared at the ceiling, pale and speckled with stains. She reached for her phone, still glowing dimly beside her. One missed call. Cameron. Her thumb hovered, indecisive, then pressed call back. He picked up on the fourth ring. "Allie?" he said, breathless. His voice was low, hushed. "Are you still outside?" Madeline sat up, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat. "No, I'm at a motel." A long pause. "I didn't know you were actually coming tonight," he said finally. "Mom told everyone you canceled." Madeline's voice sharpened. "I called her on the way, told her I was bringing gifts. She said she'd save me a plate." "She told the guests you weren't coming," he mumbled. "Said you had work." "I guess. She didn't want the evening disrupted." "Disrupted," Madeline repeated, the word acidic on her tongue. "She's just been really focused on this new business venture, the spa with Richard. Tonight was a big deal for her." Madeline leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "So big she pretended I didn't exist?" "I'm not saying it was right," Cameron said, voice slipping into his usual apologetic cadence. "She panicked. You showing up unannounced." "I wasn't unannounced," Madeline snapped. "She knew. You knew. And you let her close the door in my face." Silence stretched across the line. "She's been under a lot of stress," he offered, weaker this time. "I've been sending her mortgage money every month for 3 years," Madeline said flatly. "That wasn't enough to buy a seat at the table?" More silence. Then, "It's not like that, Allie." "Isn't it?" She could hear voices in the background, music, laughter, the party still going, as if her erasure hadn't even warranted a pause. "I just wanted to check on you," Cameron said, softer. "Make sure you were okay. Maybe we could meet for coffee tomorrow. Just you and me, talk things through." Madeline closed her eyes. That voice, the careful, smooth charm he'd always used to get out of trouble. It rang hollow now. "Sure," she said, her voice flat. "Text me." "Great. You're the best, sis. Always understanding." She didn't reply, just watched the call timer tick forward until the line went silent. But it didn't disconnect. She was about to end it when she heard Cameron's voice again, no longer soft, no longer careful. "Crisis averted," he said, chuckling. "She's at some motel. Totally bought the coffee thing." Madeline's spine straightened. She didn't move. A second voice, female, chimed in, muffled and amused. Laughter followed. "She really thinks paying for rent means she gets invited," Cameron continued. The blood drained from Madeline's face. "She's so desperate to be needed," Cameron went on, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial murmur. "She never even questions why we always need more." Madeline sat frozen in the half-lit motel room, phone still pressed to her ear, her breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a cry. Every syllable landed like a shard of glass, small, sharp, undeniable. She had given them so much. Her promotions, her holidays, her quiet Saturday mornings, translated into wire transfers, new appliances, groceries delivered across state lines, and they had reduced it all to a joke. The female voice returned, amused. "Did you see that sweater she brought? Like we'd ever let her wear that to the club." Another voice chimed in. possibly Eleanor's. At least her money doesn't talk. More laughter. Madeline ended the call, not because she'd heard enough, but because the ache of staying connected was more than she could bear. Her phone fell from her hand, landing on the bedspread like a useless relic. She stared at the ceiling again, but this time she saw clearly. Not water stains and cheap plaster, but the rot in the foundation of her family, and it was spreading long before tonight. She stood slowly and crossed to the small table in the corner, retrieving her laptop from her bag. The motel Wi-Fi blinked on reluctantly. She opened her banking app. Her fingers moved with icy precision. She wasn't crying anymore. She scrolled through every transfer, $800, 0 cents to Eleanor monthly labeled mortgage support, $500, 0 cents to Cameron labeled job transition help, holiday bonuses, emergency repairs, spa vouchers. Years of being the silent support beam in a crumbling house that had no room for her. She took screenshots, each line of evidence copied and filed away in a folder she titled simply Proof. Then came the email. She opened a new draft, addressed it to both of them. The subject line was clean, sharp, termination of financial support, effective immediately. Her message was brief. She stated the amount of financial assistance provided over the last 5 years, $83,459, 0 cents. She mentioned her documentation. She wrote that no further contact regarding money would be tolerated, and that any such attempt would be ignored or forwarded to legal counsel. No anger, no insults, just the facts. She read it twice, then hit send. Only after the email disappeared from her outbox did she return to her banking app. The automatic transfers were still scheduled, January 1st, like clockwork. She canceled them all. Next, the credit cards. She reported Cameron's secondary card as compromised and requested a replacement with a new number. Eleanor's emergency medical card, gone. The landlord of her Chicago apartment's garden unit would be next. She drafted a message to Mr. Kaplan. Cameron's sublease would not be renewed. Each cancellation, each deletion brought with it not guilt, but relief. She didn't feel like the villain. She felt like a woman finally stepping out of the shadows her family had built around her. She'd spent years trying to earn a seat at a table she had helped pay for, only to find the chairs were already full, and none had her name. Outside, the snow kept falling. The neon vacancy sign blinked on. Madeline rose from the table, unplugged her laptop, and walked back toward the bed. She looked at the crumpled pie box and the broken ribbon still lying beside her overnight bag. She didn't need to be included anymore. She needed to be free. Madeline stood at the sink of the motel bathroom, letting cold water run over her fingers before splashing it across her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, her reflection stark beneath the fluorescent light. She looked like someone who had been dragged through a storm, and in a way, she had. Only the storm had a name, and it was family. The towel smelled faintly of bleach. She pressed it to her cheeks and stared at herself in the mirror. No more pretending. No more giving. No more being the invisible backbone holding up people who would sooner erase her than thank her. By 8 a.m. she was checked out of the motel, her suitcase back in the trunk, her laptop on the passenger seat. She found a diner open off the interstate, a classic chrome-fronted spot with a blinking open sign and a waitress in a red apron who didn't ask why she was there alone the day after Christmas. Madeline ordered coffee and dry toast. Then she opened her laptop, connected to the shaky Wi-Fi, and began. The file she started was clinical. No sentiment, no self-pity. Just rows of data, dates, amounts, descriptions. She cross-referenced bank statements, email receipts, and even handwritten notes she'd kept over the years. She titled the document, 5 years of support, 0 cents a month for the mortgage. That was $9,600, 0 cents a year. She listed it year by year. Then the one-time payments, $4,000. 0 cents for the furnace, $5,000, 0 cents for Cameron's car. She attached screenshots of text messages. "Thanks, Maddie. I'll pay you back when I can." A decade later, none had. She highlighted the payment that hurt the most. December 18th, just last week, an additional $1,000, 0 cents sent as the dinner she had funded, the wine they had toasted with while pretending she didn't exist. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She didn't open it. They were trying other lines now, she was sure of it. Eleanor's friends, Cameron's girlfriend, maybe even Richard from the spa. She powered the phone down and kept typing. When she finished, the total shocked her. $83,459, 0 cents. Not including credit card debt they'd racked up under her name. Enough for a down payment on a house. Enough to start her own business. Enough to have lived without constantly checking her balance before booking flights, before buying clothes, before saying yes to dinner plans. She attached the file to a separate email addressed to her personal attorney. Not for action, not yet. Just for record, just in case. The waitress returned with a coffee refill and slid the pot across the table. "You heading home?" she asked kindly. "I think I just did," Madeline replied. She spent the rest of the morning calling customer service lines. She disputed charges. She changed passwords. She removed authorized users. The man at the bank's fraud department listened carefully, then said, "You're not the first to report this kind of thing. Financial abuse in families is more common than people realize." He didn't sound surprised. That, more than anything, told her she wasn't crazy. By noon, she had her accounts locked, her credit monitored, and her future back in her own name. She didn't cry. Not anymore. She didn't even feel broken. What she felt, surprisingly, was clear. Still sore, still scraped raw, but beneath it all, clarity. Like she'd been underwater for years and just now found the surface. She looked out the window. Snow was melting along the curb. The sky was pale, a hint of blue pushing through the gray. It wasn't peace yet. But it was something close. Back in Chicago, Madeline stepped into her apartment and was met with a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. The heating clicked softly in the background. The windows steamed faintly from the warmth inside, meeting the cold beyond. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, modest and neatly decorated, with white lights and gold ribbons. Gifts for neighbors still wrapped beneath it, but there was no chaos of torn paper. No laughter, no scent of cinnamon or pine candles burning for guests who never arrived. She slipped off her coat and walked slowly toward the kitchen, fingers brushing across the edge of her dining table. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but somehow it felt different. Not empty, just honest. Her phone, charged and waiting on the kitchen counter, blinked relentlessly with missed calls and voicemails. She picked it up, stared at the glowing screen. 47 missed calls, 11 voicemails, dozens of messages, emails, subject lines shifting from confusion to panic to anger. She opened none of them. Instead, she toggled the phone to Do Not Disturb and left it face down. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Madeline blinked against the morning light streaming through her window. She hadn't ordered anything. When she opened the door, no one stood outside. Only a box, brown and rectangular, sitting neatly on the doormat. No return address, just her name written in neat black ink, Madeline Whitmore. She brought it inside cautiously, heart pounding with a nervous edge. Inside was a file folder, her name again, this time typed on a legal tab. She flipped it open. Copies of old email threads, bank transfer screenshots she didn't recognize, even hand-signed letters from her mother requesting support for medical bills that, now confirmed, had never existed. At the bottom, a sticky note. "She's lied to more people than just you. You should know that. See." Cameron? It didn't feel like his style. Clara? No. Someone else. Richard, a former friend. A burnt bridge finally deciding to burn back? She didn't know. But it didn't matter yet. What did was that someone was validating what she already knew deep down. Her family hadn't just used her, they had manipulated and systemized the abuse. Later that evening, Lisa called on video. Her boss never called after hours. "I just wanted to say," Lisa began, "you nailed that Thornton deck. I don't know what changed over the break, but there's something different about you." Madeline smiled faintly. "I'm no longer carrying other people's weight." Lisa raised her glass of wine to the camera. "Whatever happened, hold on to that." After they hung up, Madeline sat by the window with a mug of tea, her laptop open, documents neatly sorted in a folder labeled Reclamation. She created a subfolder titled Legal, another called No Contact, and one simply named Proof of Self. She didn't need revenge. She needed a clean record. She needed protection. The weight of 1,000 compromises no longer sat on her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she considered that maybe, just maybe, there was a life waiting for her that didn't involve seeking approval from people determined to withhold it. As she closed the laptop and dimmed the lights, Madeline looked around her small apartment, this space that had so often felt like a waiting room for something better. But now, it didn't feel like she was waiting. It felt like she had arrived. The elevator in Madeline's apartment building groaned softly as it descended to the ground floor, the numbers lighting up one by one. She clutched the Tupperware container to her chest, still warm from the oven. Inside was lemon poppy seed cake, Clara's favorite. It had been exactly 3 weeks since she sent the final email to her family, closed the last bank account they could touch, and shut the metaphorical door that should have been shut long ago. The silence from Eleanor and Cameron had been total. No apologies, no explanations, just absence. Madeline didn't miss them. She stepped into the cold, her boots crunching through the last patches of snow clinging to the sidewalk. Clara lived just across the courtyard, her second-floor apartment nestled in a 1940-esque brick building that always smelled like cinnamon and old books. Every Sunday since New Year's, Clara had invited her for what she cheerfully called family supper. It had started small, just the two of them, but word spread quickly among the older residents who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, many of them widowed or distant from their own children. Soon, the apartment's living room transformed every Sunday into a soft cacophony of chatter, card games, crock-pots, and mid-century jazz. When Madeline entered, Clara was already lighting the candles on the mantel, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, a soft burgundy sweater hanging from her slight frame. "You brought the cake," Clara smiled, taking the container. "Did you put extra zest like I showed you?" Madeline smiled back. "I did, and I didn't overbake it this time." "Progress," Clara winked. "Come. The gang's already arguing about which wine goes with lasagna." In the dining room, Harold and Joan were setting out mismatched plates. Nancy, who once worked in city zoning, was explaining the historical significance of the building's original crown molding to a polite but clearly disinterested Ron. These people weren't flashy. They didn't demand anything from Madeline. They just welcomed her in, week after week, no questions asked. She hadn't realized until now how powerful that was, being allowed to just exist. After dinner, they moved to the worn velvet armchairs in Clara's living room. The old record player crackled with an Ella Fitzgerald tune as Joan dealt cards. Madeline sat beside Clara, nursing a cup of decaf coffee. The warmth seeped into her hands. She felt grounded, whole in a way that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Clara leaned in slightly. "You're quieter tonight." Madeline hesitated, then said softly, "I got a letter this week. No return address, just documents about the money I sent to my family. Proof they lied about most of it." Clara nodded slowly, setting down her cup. Someone's conscience finally stirred? I don't know who, but it didn't make me angry. It just made me tired. Clara's gaze softened. You spent years carrying people who never lifted you back. Of course you're tired, but you're also free. Madeline swallowed hard. The word hung in the air. Free. She wasn't sure she'd ever truly felt it before. Clara squeezed her hand. They don't define you anymore. Madeline looked around the room, at people who laughed without cruelty, who offered second helpings without keeping score, who showed up because they wanted to, not because they were expected to. No one had asked her for a time. No one had shamed her for wanting love. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. She felt chosen. That night, after the last teacup was washed and the chairs had been tucked back under Clara's table, Madeline lingered by the door. Snow had started falling again, light and slow, the kind that lingered more in the air than on the ground. Clara slipped a foil-wrapped bundle of leftover lasagna into her hands. For lunch tomorrow, she said, pretending it wasn't an act of maternal care. Thank you, Madeline replied, and she meant it in more ways than one. Back in her apartment, she placed the food in the fridge and turned on a single lamp in the living room. The soft golden light pooled over her desk, where her laptop still sat open beside a stack of neatly organized documents. A few weeks ago, she had created folders with names like proof, statements, archived lies, but recently a new one had appeared, future. She opened it now. Inside were scanned applications for a savings matching program she had just qualified for through her firm's financial wellness partnership. Another document listed real estate workshops hosted by the city for first-time homebuyers. She had even bookmarked a fixer-upper listing in Hyde Park, not because she was ready to buy, but because, for once, she wanted to look. The screen pinged. An email had arrived. The sender was anonymized, just a string of letters, but the subject line made her sit up straight. For your eyes only, the spa deal. She opened it carefully, pulse quickening. Inside was a PDF attachment, a signed contract between Eleanor Whitmore and Richard Linwood, officially naming them co-founders of a wellness and boutique spa in Columbus. But what drew her eyes wasn't the signatures. It was the funding ledger attached. In black and white, it detailed seed capital broken down by source. Nearly 65% of the startup funds had come from Eleanor's personal checking account, an account almost entirely funded by Madeline's monthly transfers. And then, at the bottom, one line, additional funds expected from Family Resource Account, Mem Whitmore, Q1. Rejections. They had not just used her generosity, they had budgeted it into their business plan. She pushed back from the desk, her chair scraping against the floor. Her chest tightened, not with anger this time, but with something colder. Calculated betrayal. She paced the room, arms crossed. This wasn't just exploitation. It was financial engineering with her as the silent investor, without consent, without credit, and without respect. She reopened the folder labeled legal. Her fingers hovered over her phone, not to call Eleanor, not Cameron, but someone else. She searched her inbox for a number. Elaine Chavez, estate and financial misuse attorney. The woman Lisa had once recommended when her uncle tried to raid her grandmother's trust. She copied the number, then paused. A long, hollow breath left her. Just then her phone vibrated again, a new message previewed on the screen, from an unknown number. No text, just a single image. She opened it. A photo of a check, made out to Cameron Whitmore, dated 2 weeks ago. Memo line. Final transfer before adjustment. The bank account matched Madeline's. She hadn't written that check. The snow outside thickened, the flakes now tapping gently against her windows like a reminder. Someone out there was feeding her breadcrumbs. Not to pull her back. but to show her just how far they'd gone. And suddenly Clara's words echoed in her head. "They don't define you anymore." Madeline looked out into the night. Her reflection stared back. Maybe not, but that didn't mean they wouldn't be held accountable. Not anymore. Lancaster looked smaller than she remembered. It had been over a year since Madeline last drove down the tree-lined main street, past the faded movie theater marquee and the bakery with its chipped paint and scent of sugar still lingering in the air. The familiar storefronts hadn't changed, but everything inside her had. She pulled into a modest parking lot outside the Civic Center, where a job fair was underway. Her company had a recruiting table inside, and she had offered, perhaps too eagerly, to represent them for the day. Lisa hadn't questioned her motive. She was too impressed with Madeline's sudden clarity, her feely focus. What no one knew, what Madeline hadn't admitted even to herself, was that she had scanned the local calendar and circled this event the moment she saw one name on the list of registrants, Cameron Whitmore. She didn't plan to confront him. Not yet, but she wanted to see for herself. The spa was gone, their house sold, the glamorous life built on her back now just whispers. She wanted to look into his eyes and see if he still had the audacity to smile. Inside, the Civic Center was bustling. Too much cologne, loud voices, and the desperate hue of people chasing second chances. Madeline moved through the crowd in a crisp blazer, her name tag pinned neatly, her posture composed. She stood out not because she tried, but because she no longer needed anything from anyone here. It took less than 10 minutes to spot him. Cameron stood near the back, shifting uncomfortably in a poorly fitted sport coat, resume clutched in hand. He looked older, not in years, but in wear. There was no polish, no easy charm like he'd wielded so well over the phone that night she sat alone in a motel room, listening to him laugh about her naivety. He didn't see her until she stepped into line behind him at the free coffee station. When he finally turned, his eyes widened, his body locking like he'd been caught shoplifting. "Madeline," he said too quickly, too brightly. "Wow, what are the odds?" She gave a small, dry smile. "Hello, Cameron?" He reached out awkwardly for a hug, and she didn't move. His arms fell back to his sides like an afterthought. "I had no idea you'd be here," he said, eyes darting. "You look great." "Really? I'm here for work," she replied coolly. "Recruiting, tech sector's expanding, lots of opportunity." "Yeah, I thought I'd see what's out there," he said, adjusting his tie, which wasn't quite straight. "Trying to get back on my feet. Things have been tough." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. After a tense beat, Cameron looked down, then motioned toward the hallway. "Can we maybe talk? Just us?" Madeline followed him into a quieter alcove lined with folding chairs and a vending machine that buzzed faintly. For a moment, it felt like the edge of something, like the end of a long, winding trail where she'd been dragging a weight she could finally set down. Cameron glanced around, then said, "Listen, about what happened, with Mom, the house, the spa. It all spiraled. None of it went how we planned." "Planned?" she repeated softly. He winced. "That's not what I meant. I mean, we thought it would help everyone, you included." She met his gaze for the first time, sharp and unyielding. "No, Cameron, you helped yourselves. I funded the illusion." He looked away. "She thought you'd forgive us eventually. She was wrong." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth, plain and unvarnished, was heavier than anger, and for the first time since they were children, Cameron had nothing to say. The silence between them stretched until it felt like a third person in the room. Heavy, breathing, undeniable. Cameron finally exhaled, the breath shaky. "I didn't know she'd do that. Shut the door on you like that." "She didn't just shut the door, Cameron," Madeline said, arms crossed. "She erased me while pouring wine I paid for. while bragging about a spa I unknowingly bankrolled. He nodded, but the motion was empty, like he thought the act of agreeing would earn forgiveness he hadn't earned. I didn't come here to make a scene, she added. I'm not here to scream or demand anything. He looked confused, as if that in itself were more unsettling than anger. I came because I needed to see you, she said. See what you look like without the money, without the lifelines I used to throw you. I wanted to know if you'd be different. His lips parted, then closed again. She waited. Nothing came. I guess that answers it, she said. He sat down heavily on the folding chair against the wall, rubbing his hands together. It wasn't all fake, you know. You helped us, but we did appreciate it. No, she said, firm. You appreciated the money, not me. You proved that the moment you laughed at me on the phone. His face flushed, and his mouth opened again. But this time, she cut him off. Don't say you didn't know the call was still connected. Don't say you didn't mean it. You did. He stared at the floor. We were desperate. The spa was bleeding money. Richard bailed halfway through and Mom panicked. She thought I'd keep saving her, Madeline interrupted. Because I always did. Because I was the invisible ATM in Chicago, not a daughter. Cameron's voice dropped. We've lost everything. The house, the memberships, even the car. Madeline didn't flinch. Not everything. You still have your shame, unless you sold that too. He looked up, something flickering behind his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or maybe just recognition that the old rules no longer applied. She misses you, you know, he offered. Madeline smiled faintly. Tell her I don't miss her money management. Cameron sighed and stood slowly. I guess this is the part where you walk away. No, Madeline said calmly. That part happened a year ago. You just didn't feel it until now. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He stared at it warily before accepting it. Inside was a copy of the bank records. Highlighted transfers, notes on transactions labeled emergency that matched luxury purchases, receipts for spa equipment, wine shipments, Aspen airfare. This is what family cost me, she said. Don't ever ask for more. He looked at the paper, stunned into silence. Are you going to go public with this? I don't need to, she replied. You'll do it yourselves. She walked away before he could answer, heels echoing down the hallway with steady, deliberate rhythm. Outside, the cold stung her face, but it no longer felt like punishment. It was just air, just weather, not a reflection of her anymore. As she reached her car, she didn't look back. Inside the Civic Center, the job fair buzzed on without her. Some bridges, she realized, didn't need to burn, they just needed to be left behind. Spring arrived in Chicago, not with a flourish, but with quiet defiance. Buds on the magnolia trees outside, Madeline's building, the first hum of lawnmowers in nearby yards, and light that lingered just a little longer each evening. The thaw came slowly, but it came. So did the letter. It arrived on a Thursday, thick paper, no return address, postmarked from Lancaster. Inside, a single sheet, handwritten in looping cursive. The signature was unmistakable. Eleanor Whitmore. Madeline didn't read it right away. She placed it on the kitchen counter, next to a bowl of fruit and a magazine she'd stopped subscribing to months ago but never bothered canceling. She made tea. She cleaned out the fridge. She took a walk. She folded laundry that didn't need folding. Only when the sky dimmed into soft blue did she return to the envelope. She sat by the window, tea cooling beside her, and unfolded the page with steady fingers. Madeline, I imagine you've stopped using the name. That's your right. I hope you'll at least read what I've written. There it was. No greeting, no warmth, just control masquerading as contrition. She read on. I won't defend what happened. You have every reason to hate me. I only want you to know that things fell apart after you left. Richard withdrew. The spa never opened. Cameron blames me. The house is gone. Everything is gone. Madeline paused. Not a word about love. Not a word about regret that didn't involve consequences. The sentence that followed made her jaw tighten. We were never good at emotions, you and I. I didn't know how to raise a daughter who needed things I didn't understand, but I always admired your strength. She skimmed the rest, mentions of pride, regrets phrased as misunderstandings, the kind of letter written not to mend, but to cleanse a conscience. At the bottom in crisp black ink, if you ever want to reconnect, I'll be here, Eleanor. Madeline folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stood, walked to her desk drawer, and slid it inside. She didn't tear it up. She didn't burn it. It wasn't worth the ceremony. Instead, she opened the folder labeled Future on her laptop and clicked into a document titled Whitmore Strategy Collective Statement of Intent. The name gleamed at the top of the draft. Not Eleanor's legacy, not Cameron's inheritance. Hers. The collective had been her idea, a strategic consultancy rooted in ethical business practices, founded in response to everything she'd once ignored. Quietly, over the last 6 months, she'd assembled a small, sharp team of women she met through community networks, former clients, and late-night Zoom calls. Women like her. Overlooked, underestimated, and finally finished with waiting. The launch event was scheduled for next week. The final press kit was queued, the website ready. The office signage had just been installed that morning. Brushed steel letters shining against the white brick of a converted loft in Pilsen. She would walk into that space as Madeline Whitmore, yes, but no longer the daughter, not the benefactor, not the disappointment. She was her own name now, and she had chosen it. Outside the window, the light turned gold. Somewhere in the city, church bells rang faintly through the open pane. Madeline closed her laptop, her reflection mirrored in the black screen. She didn't need Eleanor's permission to exist anymore. She never had. The morning of the launch dawned clear and bright, a rarity in early April. Madeline stood in front of the newly painted door of 741 West 18th Street, her hand resting on the cool metal handle. Above her, the sign gleamed, Whitmore Strategy Collective. She didn't flinch to the name anymore. It wasn't a tribute. It wasn't a forgiveness. It was a reclamation. Inside, sunlight poured across polished concrete floors and a long walnut conference table surrounded by mismatched but carefully chosen chairs. The space felt open, intentional, like everything in her life was finally taking shape around design, not damage. Clara arrived first, a bouquet of pale yellow tulips in her arms. For the woman who finally stopped asking for permission, she said, handing them over with a knowing smile. Madeline placed the tulips in a cobalt vase and set them on the reception desk. One by one, guests began to trickle in. Former clients who admired her tenacity, former colleagues who once underestimated her, and women she'd coached, through midnight emails and coffee shop meetings. Every handshake, every word of support felt like mortar between the bricks of something solid and lasting. By noon, the room hummed with conversation and warmth. A local reporter snapped photos. A nonprofit founder offered a collaboration. A venture partner asked if she'd be interested in mentoring younger entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. Madeline listened, nodded, smiled. But beneath it all, she carried a quiet current of clarity. She didn't owe anyone anything. Not her time, not her name, not her pain. Every connection now would be by choice, not obligation. Near the end of the event, someone tapped her shoulder. She turned, surprised. It was her father. She hadn't seen him in nearly 15 years, not since he left for Florida with a woman half his age and a promise to stay in touch. He stood in a blazer, too crisp for the weather, holding a card in one hand and a look of discomfort in the other. "Hi, Maddie," he said, using the nickname she'd long since buried. "I read about the collective in the Tribune. I thought I'd stop by." Her first instinct was ice, but then she caught the glance of Clara across the room. Steady, calm, without judgment. Madeline turned back. "You can call me Madeline," she said evenly. He blinked. "Right. Sorry. You look good. Successful." "I am." He handed her the card. She took it without reading. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but there was nothing left to explain. Not anymore. She gave him a nod, dignified, detached, and final. Then, as easily as he appeared, he drifted back into the crowd and out the door. She didn't watch him go. That evening, when the guests were gone and the office finally quiet again, Madeline stood alone at the center of the space. The last rays of daylight angled through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. She walked to the front desk and opened the drawer. Inside was the card from her father, still unopened. She looked at it a long moment, then slid it under the vase of tulips without reading it. Some names weren't worth remembering. Some ties weren't worth retracing. She pulled out her phone and took a single photo of the room, the sign on the wall, the tulips, the empty chair at the head of the table. Then she posted it with a simple caption. "Sometimes the name they tried to stain is the one you build an empire with." She hit share. And then she exhaled. Slow, full, free. Thank you for staying with Madeline's story until the very end. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about boundaries. About what happens when you finally stop explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. Madeline's journey is one that resonates with so many of us. Those who gave and gave, hoping that love would be enough to heal what was broken. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, not in anger, but in clarity. Not in revenge, but in reclaiming your peace. If you've ever been the black sheep, the silent supporter, the invisible backbone of a family that never truly saw you, this story was for you. And if you're still finding your voice, still learning that no is a complete sentence, and that your value doesn't need anyone's validation, know this: you are not alone. Families don't always break in loud, dramatic moments. Sometimes it's the quiet erasures, the casual exclusions, the way they pretend your generosity was their right. And sometimes healing isn't about going back. It's about building something forward with people who choose you without condition. Madeline chose her name, her future, her peace, and you can too. If this story touched something in you, share it. Comment below and tell us your moment of clarity, your moment of no more, because the more we speak these truths, the less power they have over us. And remember, family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by love, by choice, by respect. Thank you for being here. We see you, we hear you, and you are enough, always.